Hello, I'm Robin Lustig.
And I'm Rithala Shah.
Thank you for downloading the World Tonight podcast from the BBC.
With in-depth reporting, intelligent analysis and major breaking news from a global perspective.
You can...
Now, if I ask you what you think about the price of food, your first reaction might be that it hurts. It's going up, and significantly so. In the last few years, the cost of basic commodities like corn, soy and sugar has been a headache not just for us as consumers, but for governments, as spiralling prices have provoked protests worldwide. You could say they were the spark for the Arab Spring, as we heard at the time.
The dramatic events in Tunisia have put authoritarian governments in the Arab world on notice. Global food prices hit a record high in December.
The chant is defiant. Rise up, Khartoum. They've put up prices on some foodstuffs and fuel.
Youth in Algeria are taking to the streets to protest rising food prices. The cost of flour, sugar and oil.
United Nations has called an urgent meeting on a spike in global food prices that's fueling unrest in several countries. At least 7 people were killed.
So what's driving this inflation? Well, greater demand from a growing global population, especially in Asia. Supply problems with droughts, floods and other climate hazards reducing crop yields. But also, perhaps, speculators who stand accused of manipulating prices on the futures market, where what's being bought isn't the actual food, but the right to buy a quantity of, say, corn or cocoa a couple of years ahead. In a few minutes, you'll hear that this is the subject of furious debate. First, we asked Paul Moss to investigate why the futures market exists.
Hello, mate.
This is how I imagined it would be when I went to visit Lawrence Matthews at his farm in Surrey, the proud farmer tending to his sheep, cows and pigs. The truth is, though, that when I showed up at Manor Farm, Lawrence was doing something very different, but, he says, equally important. He was on the internet checking out the price of crops on the international futures market, because Lawrence, like most farmers, sells his crops in advance. Indeed, sometimes he sells produce before he's even planted it. He sees what the going rate is, for example, for a ton of wheat delivered in the autumn of 2013. Then he finds a merchant who will sign a contract promising to buy the crop at that price once it's been harvested.
Selling in advance is so important because we know the price are we going to get for the crop when we sell it. It's not good practice just to put something in the ground, let it grow and then expect a price. We have to plan forward and budget, as all good businesses would do. And if we can see there are good prices or prices that we can make a profit at, then we can start to plant crops.
And what if this system didn't exist, if you had to just sell the crop once you'd harvested it, send it to market and get what price you could?
If there was no other system, we'd have to do it, but it would be much more insecure and you would gamble a lot more. And I don't think gambling is a way to run a business.
And this is where all that wheat, corn and other produce ends up, in a great big storage facility. The particular one I'm visiting is in Immingham in Lincolnshire. And it's owned by one of this country's leading agricultural merchants, Gleddles. These are the people who agree to buy a farmer's crops in advance at a fixed price, and the merchants then sell it to end users like food manufacturers or flour mills or anyone else who needs agricultural produce. But here's the thing, merchants like Gleddles also don't want to gamble. They don't want to promise to buy a crop at one price and then a year later find that the price has dropped and they have to sell it at a loss. So the merchants also have a way of avoiding this. And here with me to explain how they do it is Gleddles Managing Director, David Shepherd.
We go to the futures market, normally London, and sell futures for forward months, which secures a price equivalent to the price we paid the farmer. This protects us from any collapse in forward prices.
So if you've got no one who will buy at the price the farmer sold it to you, someone's got an obligation somewhere in the world to buy that grain at that future price.
Yeah, obviously you pitch your price to farmers relative to the available futures prices forward.
It is a bewildering operation to watch. The Chicago Agricultural Futures Exchange is the biggest in the world. It's a market that saw much of its regulation lifted in the year 2000 and now sees futures and options trading hands at an unprecedented rate. Here in the UK, agricultural futures are traded entirely by computer, a quieter affair, though no less hectic. Indeed, trade in agricultural futures is now one of the faster-growing sectors in the world of finance. The Far East is driving increasing demand for food, and the wildly unpredictable weather of recent years has made for wildly varying supply. So, prices go up and down, and there's money to be made from guessing in advance which way they will go. Marek Spectron is one of the biggest brokerage firms in the business, and Jonathan Parkman is in charge of its agricultural division.
There are agricultural investment funds that will invest in all types of different parts of the agricultural chain, and they can be anything from 20 to 30 million in funds up to many billions of funds. A lot of pension funds decided that it was prudent to have a proportion of their holdings in commodities. There are large amounts of money at stake.
The question, though, is who is getting that money. In theory, the futures market has straightforward winners and losers. Those dealers who buy and sell agricultural futures are choosing to gamble, and some reap the rewards, while others equally suffer the losses. But some argue there are now people who always lose, and that's ordinary consumers around the world who end up paying more for their food.
Stop food speculation!
The campaign group, the World Development Movement, has been organising protests against the workings of the agricultural futures market. One of its spokeswomen, Heidi Chow, told me how she sees the problem.
What we've seen since the 1990s is successive waves of deregulation, which has allowed financial players to come into these markets and pour lots of money into them. They are placing like an upward bet on these food prices, which is trickling through to the prices that we're seeing on the ground. This is a problem because people on the lowest incomes rely on stable and affordable food prices to be able to eat.
You certainly can see the increasing cost of food. I'm just walking through a street market in West London, and a lot of the things they're selling on the stores here are more expensive, like bread, reflecting the increasing cost of grain. And if you go into the shops on this street, they too are selling food much more expensively than they were just a year ago. And talking to the people doing their shopping, it seems that many really have noticed the difference.
No, I plan the menus every day, but now I have to watch what we are going to eat because the prices have gone up.
What have you noticed in terms of food prices?
How little you get for your money now. You just spend £50 or so, but seem to have very little for that.
Let us end the situation where the World Food Programme paid $50 million to one large commodity trader.
The European Union is trying to do something. It's been considering proposals to impose new regulation on the trade in agricultural futures. Supporters of the move warned that speculators not only drive food prices up in the long term, but that they also increase price volatility as large investors pile into a produce one minute and then decide to sell it the next. This claim has now been acknowledged by the man who actually represents commodity traders in Britain. Anthony Bell-Chambers is Chief Executive of the Futures and Options Association, and he agrees that price instability can be a problem.
The speculators will take on the risks that the physical market participants, farmers, producers and so on, will want to lay off. So they take that risk off those people, and that's really important. The downside is speculators can create short-term bubbles, often because everyone is herding into a particular position. Anything like that can generate that kind of problem.
The new EU legislation on commodities trading is currently being considered by both the European Parliament and Commission. However, the measures are opposed by the British government. The Treasury says the proposed rules would not help to dampen price volatility in the futures market. But a spokesman insisted they do take this issue seriously and recognise that unstable food prices have a wide-ranging impact, especially on the poor.
Paul Moss reporting.